Dr. Hershkop graduated Yeshiva College in 1999, went on to get his PhD from Columbia in computer science, has since taught at Columbia for about 10 years, computer science.
Too long.
More than 10 years, and is currently teaching at Penn, has been involved in multiple startups. His primary focus is security and things related thereto, and he's going to talk to us about that tonight. And without any further ado, please give a round of applause for Dr. Hershkop.
So as Judah mentioned, I was here in the last century. A lot has changed in computer science and in security in many different ways. So as mentioned, I've done a lot of different kinds of teaching at all levels, undergrad, master, a lot of fun. Some of the projects actually came out of classes. Students were motivated enough, so we spun them up and helped with the research. I've spun out some of the technologies into startups, some current startups, some side project for startups. So it's a lot of fun doing applied research in security and machine learning. There's something new every day, and there's something especially rewarding taking what you learn in the classroom, making it real, going to a company and actually selling it as a product. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about, I found a comic that actually sort of sequences the entire talk into 3 panels. So talk a little bit about security, what cybersecurity is, what information security is, both from a high level and a detail level. Talk a little bit about the different research projects related to security and machine learning, and then especially talk about behavior-based security. So if you decide to walk out now because you're done eating, what you should remember is that there's something out there called behavior-based security, and I'll talk a little bit about traditional and the new stuff. There is no single solution for security. I was at Black Hat. It's a big security conference. You see 30,000 booths. Everyone solved the problem. If you walk in that room, it sounds like no one has to do any security research or products. That's not the case. There's a big problem with cost dynamics, and I'll explain that as I go through. It costs almost nothing to set up a big cyber warfare, cyber attack system. So there's a lot of easy ways to get into the system. And there's a real gap of what's happening there and what we know and what we don't know, and I'll highlight those. And people never look at their printers or any other devices. So your refrigerator today has a full system inside. Nobody's really monitoring. Nobody was monitoring, and it's starting to change. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start talking a little bit about security and then segment into some incidents that you might have seen in the news and then break them up into from the cybersecurity. Hopefully at the end, you'll see why I like security, why it's different every day. Hopefully not too paranoid, but a little bit paranoid about what you do and how you use computers. So a common model is usually an easy way to convey an idea. There's a couple of different security models that you can use. I especially like this one. It's a networked information security model that basically abstracts. And abstraction is what helps the technology space move up in unimaginable ways in the last couple of years. And the idea is that at each layer, we're only concentrating on that layer, looking at it from a security, the input and the output, what's coming in, what's going out. The bottom layer is sort of the environment that everything exists in. That's where you start. You have your computer hardware and the abstract idea, what it depends on. There's no electricity, your computer's not working generally, things like that. And then the hardware makes some guarantees about security, and then you take it into the OS, the network, the application. There's users, real users, who use some of these systems, and then there's society rules that govern how you use the systems and what you do with them. And security cannot be applied to only one segment of this model. It's really across the different layers, and that's what I want to highlight in today's talk. Not just the weaknesses of the different layers, but sort of where the attack space is and where the solutions in the space are. If you run any infrastructures, if you run any systems, one day you will graduate and you might have to build systems or maintain systems. These are pretty common. So you have these like CERT, which is a agency that releases warnings. You get these emails that say, the sky is falling if you don't patch it. Some new patches come out again. This is from a couple of weeks ago. Oracle, and you get the idea. And these patches are not, again, concentrated in any one program or application or level. They cross many domains. So in general, when we talk about security, whether we're looking at information, which is the data layer, or system-level security, we're looking at CIA, basically, the 3 properties that we want to guarantee. So the first C is confidentiality. Is it, if I want to keep it to myself, can I? The integrity is, if I think I put something in the document, is it there when I come back to check? And the availability, if I put up a web server, can I get to it later? So security is not a new problem. It's been around forever. They were talking about this before there was widespread adoption of systems. In the early 80s, people were writing proof of concept viruses out there. But in the end of the day, today, people are spending, the market is about $80 billion and growing. It's projected much crazier numbers. I'm trying to keep it normal. So the question is, why are we spending $80 billion on something that's been around forever? So if we look at it just from I showed it a layered view, but when you use the system today, you sign into, say, a banking app on your browser. So you have your laptop computer, wherever it came from. You're running some system that comes from Microsoft or from Firefox, Mozilla. You have some application running in there. Your email client is running alongside you. If there's a weakness in any of them, now you're dependent on your email provider, whoever wrote your email client, to keep it updated, your app, your browser, and you get the idea. As the data travels out on your local ISP or university network and then hits the Amazon cloud, there's a lot of moving pieces, and everyone depends on someone else to maintain their security. Any weakness anywhere destroys everyone's security view. And then there's the internet infrastructure, right? We all depend on DNS. DNS goes down, the internet goes down. So if you have a job protecting, so you're hired somewhere to do security work at a company using your computer science knowledge, security in the enterprise breaks itself into different pieces. So if you take a look at NIST, NIST sort of identifies the different pieces. The talk today, I can spend all day on any of the pieces and any of the subparts. Security is huge. I'm specifically going over only the intrusion detection and prevention and analysis on that, sort of the detect portion of that model. That's where I'm concentrating the talk on. Generally speaking, businesses make risk assessments. They decide how risky is something to the business, and then they make some arbitrary line with this is what they're going to deal with and this is what they're not, and that's how they make budgets and decisions. And there's a tolerance. Do I think something's a problem? If not, I don't care. Let someone else deal with it. Or if we get hacked and there is no cost associated with it, I don't want to think about it. But the truth is that the security crosses all the spaces. So if you think something's not a risk, you might not be right. And like I mentioned, refrigerator printers, no one even thought that they were a problem until, I'll get into that in a second. So the general issue is you go to the store, you buy a device, you plug it in, you test it. Use a printer as an example just because I've had some good experience with those. If you set up a printer and I print my resume, it seems to be working, resume spits out, I hope it's okay. But the question fundamentally is the device that you bought really doing what it's supposed to? I bought a printer, is it really only printing? Is it doing anything malicious? Is your printer attacking your fridge? Well, we'll talk about that. And then once you do plug in these new devices, and people do this all the time, how safe are your information? Is your personal information on your laptop now safe because you have a new printer in the room? In general, just to give you an idea, even with $80 billion spent, the Verizon report sort of has a very nice, it's a yearly report that comes out. They have a yearly survey, what's happening. Attackers get into systems and stay inside systems. It used to be 200 and something days. I think now it's 210 days. But the idea is that there's attackers running around systems for months before anyone catches on that they're there. So let's talk a little bit about some of the famous stories that you might have seen and some of the famous stories that you haven't seen. What I want to do is break it up from a perspective of someone who security who has to defend against these systems, and somebody, someone like you. There's someone out there who's writing these software, writing malware. If you can get a really good job in computer science, there's a lot of money in malware. This is not a job talk for that. But the idea is that it's a moving system. There's a lot of moving pieces. But it's the same kind of skills that you build applications, you break applications. So I want to sort of highlight where the weaknesses are. And I'm going to use terms over and over just to make sure that everyone knows what all the terms are. So insiders are generally people who have authorized access. So if you have an employee at a company and they decide to do something malicious, we usually refer to them as insiders. They have permission to be there, but not necessarily permission to do what they want. Hackers are usually people who come from the outside. And masqueraders are hackers or insiders who take on someone else's credentials. So if somebody steals my username and password, they're Shlomo as far as the system is concerned, but they're not really Shlomo. We call these masquerades, and each of them are sort of a different set of the problem. Viruses, most people know, it's a malicious program that's running, or it could be Office. Depends. It depends how you look at it. Malware is also, any of these. There's a lot of different flavors of malware. Some of them are viruses, and some of them are viruses that spread. We usually call these worms. The botnets are systems that are compromised that are usually synchronizing with each other, possibly taking some command and control from somewhere. These evolve over time. I'm just giving you a snapshot. Phishing is just the act of trying to trick someone into doing something. It's a social engineering trick. You get an email, it looks like from someone you know, or it looks like something that it's interesting. You click on it, now they have a step in. And surprisingly enough, people don't realize how flexible documents are. You can get a document to do almost anything. In fact, I've done it on a couple of different projects. So let me start with worms and make my way forward. Code Red Worm, if you've heard about it, great. If not, I'll give you a very quick overview of what it did and where it touched on the model. So the Code Red Worm was one of the first instances of a malware spreading out very fast, taking over a lot of the internet. This hit at the time, Microsoft IIS servers were almost everywhere. There was a vulnerability that came out, so someone discovered something, Microsoft patched it. And about a month later, one of the attackers took the patch, figured out what the problem was, everyone knew about it, and decided to write a virus to take advantage of it. It was actually an interesting virus, so there was a phishing attack to get in. It was something interesting, you clicked on it. It was a malware package that took over the servers, defaced the website, and then it continued spreading. And it actually had an algorithm. It didn't just spread randomly. They learned from the past. So there was a schedule. So the beginning of the month, this was probably a homework problem in some CS course. The beginning of the month, it spread around, and it just did, full IP sweep. Towards the end of the month, 20 to 27th day, initiated a denial of service attack. They had a list of IP addresses. If you looked inside, you can see White House was one of them. And then the end of the month, I guess they didn't want to code differences in the month, February versus all the other months. So they went to sleep, figuring if they're asleep, it's great. So people quickly realized this was a problem. They wrote out a signature. This is what it looks like. This is what it does. They spread it around. And a few months later, they changed a letter. So instead of a bunch of A's, it was now N's. Nobody can catch it. And now this Code Red 2 spread. So there's a problem here. But again, and these viruses and worms got even worse over time. Somebody wrote a paper how to take over the internet in 15 minutes, and someone wrote a worm to do that. Great research collaboration. On a more higher level sort of piece of work, not so self-contained, is Stuxnet. Most people have heard about it. I don't know, anyone examined the binaries? Copies available after the talk. So the idea here, this was a concentrated attack. This is what we call a nation-state problem. This used to be someone else's problem. I'm not that important. You'll see why that's not true anymore. This had multiple touches on this model that I'm using. So there was an initial attack vector to get this malware in. It came in on a USB stick. Once it got in, it was great. It spread around. In fact, the systems that were all infected would make sure that there was patches. So if there were 6 computers infected and one of them had an updated version, it would give out the patch, nicely done, to everyone else. Microsoft should learn from this. Interesting enough, they had a couple of zero-day attacks. So zero-day attacks are attacks that we don't have solutions against. Those are extremely rare and very expensive. If you find it, cash out on it. They included multiple zero-day, which is quite unusual. There was a command and control system, so the systems were all talking to each other and figuring out what to do. They actually had a pretty clever algorithm to figure out if they should be attacking you. So if it would get into your machine, it would make sure that you had certain software installed, certain language packs, hint, hint, hint. And then it would bury itself into the system. And the real target was the computers that were controlling these machines that they were interested in. And the idea was, it was clever, is that they took the audit stream coming out of some of these spinners, captured a couple of hours of data, and they replayed it while they messed with the motors. So if you're looking at the system from the outside, everything looks green. They're all spinning at the right speed. They were messing with the motors, trying to figure out, trying to break them without being too obvious. In addition, they also had stolen digital certs, which is pretty hard to get. So they signed it. So if you looked at the malware, it was signed by some European company, looked legit. They were pretty under the radar. It would also destroy itself if it couldn't get in. So it would attempt, and then if not, blow it away. When I do an IDS or a virus course, we break apart the malware we talk about, because a lot of this stuff was done in different places by either malware or realware. And there was a lot of overlap to make sure that the thing spread in the way it went. Related to this kind of state-level malware, there's also spyware. You can install something to monitor keyboards. Rats are classes of stuff that give you remote access Trojans. They give you remote access if you break in. Not only can you collect the keyboard logs, but you can also get other stuff. Sometimes people get camera feeds. I have a little sticker on my camera. I am paranoid. And sometimes microphones and other stuff. So what's interesting about Flame, this is the same guys who wrote us Stuxnet. It came earlier, but was only found later. Once they started looking for stuff, once you're suspicious and paranoid, you start to find things. So they found this. Putting a year to it is hard. Nobody actually published the source code yet. But it seemed to be running for a couple of years. It was messing around with the dates. I'm not going into crypto at all, but there was an interesting cryptographic attack where they were able to get into a Windows service. They had about, I think, 3 or 5 millisecond time to pull this off, which they did. They generated fake certs and were able to get in. And the idea was just to spy, figure out what's out there, what these systems that Stuxnet later attacked look like, and what the naming schemes are and things like that. And like I said, they captured microphone traffic. It spread through USB or the LAN once they were inside the network. So they got into networks that weren't even connected to the internet through the USB. And then they went to nearby devices using Bluetooth to hop around. Surprise, surprise, you can use the environment layer in the model to move around laterally once you attack someone. So in general, there's also classes of attacks that people don't think of. Some of the stuff I've done in the past. So this is hardware level, where you can use the hardware itself to get around the systems. These are for APTs, which is Advanced Persistent Threats. These are buried stuff that people don't notice and operate for years sometimes, under the radar, doing things, whatever they want to do. And they're very either low when they use, like I said, the society, they're at the application level or the OS, and then they're embedded in the malware. So I'll start with a famous example that almost no one's ever heard of. This is the Greek cell phone story. This happened a couple of years ago now. Like all good stories in hacking, someone was found dead. It turns out this is the guy who was running the main systems in the phone company there. Once they started to dig through his office, they found that there was stuff happening with the phone system that shouldn't be. The short and long was that somebody had patched, and they did a really good job. They ran a patch against the system without needing a reboot, so they had to write little patches. And the idea was they were hooking onto about 100 high-ranking officials, rerouting their cell phone calls. So you'd call them, you'd call the Prime Minister of Greece, and you get through, but your call was getting pumped to somewhere else. The only reason they got caught, and don't do this, please, if you're doing something like this, is they wrote a patch and they broke something, so it ended up spilling into the logs, and the logs were complaining. The company was called, and they said, hey, you didn't pay for this piece. We didn't install it. Turns out there was a set of malware that nobody's taken credit for yet. But this was, this was pretty bad. So they were getting into the infrastructure of the cell phone company, and getting what they wanted. There's a more famous story that people are aware of, Target having their point-of-sale service systems compromised. In this case, there was a third-party credentials that somebody got into the Target servers, then they infected. Not really clear because Target isn't telling, but from what you can piece back from the reports, possibly an SQL injection or other kind of injection attack to get control of the systems that run the point of sale systems, patch that, push the patch down. All the point of sales now capturing credit cards. Credit cards are coming to a single file, FTP it out. Surprise enough, they did have an intrusion detection system in place, but like many other stories, no one was looking at the alarms. You'd be surprised how noisy these systems can be. I saw a demo from one of the big vendors. They were showing off what they were doing because I was showing them what I was doing. And they were like, with a straight face saying, yes, we generate 10,000 alerts a minute. Nobody can read 10,000 alerts a minute. So what happens is you're supposed to then score it, and somebody's going to look at a couple of them. But when it's making a lot of noise, not always are you going to actually get what you're supposed to be getting. There was a story from a couple of weeks ago which everyone is denying across the board, which means it's true. That's in my book. So this is a story that possibly somebody's compromised the motherboard manufacturing and snuck in a chip, and now it has a backdoor that's embedded on the hardware level. The argument against it is that, oh, anyone can find it. It's pretty hard. Isolating a single chip that looks like a screw is going to be hard unless somebody really stumbles on it. You can do it, the story is not unbelievable because all these different pieces are around. Just no one's actually caught anyone doing it. So we'll see how this develops. It's related to another story that Dell had, $300 million of damages. I actually had a problem with a motherboard like this, where one of our servers stopped running, you open up the case, the motherboard has exploding components. So what was the story? Somebody had done industrial espionage, stolen the formula for the capacitors. They cost a couple of pennies. They sold Dell cheaper capacitors by a penny or two, but they buy enough capacitors, it was a problem when these start to explode because they didn't steal all the ingredients. Lesson learned, if you're going to take the ingredients, take all of them. So there are stories where people have messed with the hardware level issues, so it's not impossible. And like I mentioned, exploding printers. Never let PhD students be bored. This is what can happen. So a bunch of bored PhD students sitting around wondering, can you blow up a printer, right? You have a printer in the corner. So what's running? Look at the motor. The motor's controlled by software. The software has patches. Oh, look, it's written in PostScript. PostScript, you can do a lot of stuff in PostScript. Reverse engineered the controls, rewrote the controls so it would burn out the motor by just spinning it up as fast as possible. Patched the printer, now the printer has some malware, it's running the thing and stops, it doesn't actually catch fire. We were able to get it to put some brown marks on the paper. Turns out, can't mention the manufacturer, but the manufacturer actually thought of bored PhD students and they had a thermal switch that would turn off. This was not software controlled at that time. So when the temperature got too high, just shut everything down. So that didn't work anywhere. So you have bored PhD students, a great project that you just wasted 2 months on, you got to do something with it. Try to tell people that printers are a problem, no one's listening. So we wrote a virus. We embedded this virus in a PDF. You can put PostScript files in a PDF. I send you my resume, you print it. During the print operation, the printer is processing the PDF and the PostScript. Now it has an update. Now it sends me emails of everything you print. Well, now people are getting attention. People got scared of this. If I can send you a PDF and everyone's printing PDFs and now I'm getting emails of your thing, I should be looking at the printer. And this is a general misuse of things. People are not looking at IoT devices in the same way now that they realize they could be compromised. A similar project ended up taking over VoIP phones. I make a phone call, you mess around with some of the protocols and headers, or you come around with a USB stick equivalent. You can compromise a phone and then turn it on without turning on the microphone light. You can use it as an eavesdropping device. Everyone has VoIP phones everywhere. This was proven against multiple manufacturers that this is a problem. Again, security is not always a first order element when people are doing design. It's a problem. Phishing, as I mentioned, is getting more and more sophisticated. There's a lot of NLP and machine learning tools out there. It's amazing what you can do to replay people's voices, text to speech. Extremely tailored. So this is a big problem. That's how a lot of malware get in companies, unfortunately. So the general trend in the industry is something like 1 in 3 people will click on a virus if it's in an email or things like that. You pay for expensive training, and there's multiple companies out there that'll do it. It seems to drop to 1 in 5, which means about 19–20% of the people are still clicking on the stuff. And as I said, it's getting a lot more sophisticated. So there's very easy ways of getting into systems. Now the question is, why are people doing it? Why is so many systems out there being attacked? There is a class of attacks that just people are having fun, like bored PhD students. But for the most part, what you see is that there's a class of attacks where there's a lot of money to be made. And there's multiple stories out there. Sometimes it's revenge. Someone gets fired. He feels that I helped the company deal with an issue. Somebody got only $1 million bonus. He thought he should have got $1.5 million. That happens to all of us. So he went in and erased all their servers and broke, things like that. Sometimes it's to manipulate data where the stock market gets affected by some data that some companies are releasing. So if you can mess with that, then you can short on the stock. Don't do that. It's not a good way to make a living. Sometimes it's industrial espionage, like I mentioned, and sometimes it's cyber warfare, where you have nation states or nation state level issues, and sometimes it's just political. People don't like someone's view. So I'll go transition into security itself. So most people assume that most of the attacks are happening from the outside, but when you look at the actual data, most of the problems are from the insiders, people who have access and then decide they want to do something with that. It's not always in the public data because companies, unless they are in some compliance zone, don't have to report on everything. They're embarrassed. Sometimes they just fire them and these people take the source code and go somewhere else. I've seen that happen, where a company was hacked and then they asked around and the company this guy was working at was also hacked. There's a chain of where this guy was doing the same thing many times. It was caught at the last person. So as I mentioned, nation state used to be this, government agencies who have a lot of resources, can dump a lot of mathematicians and systems and resources in order to find the problems and create attack weapons. These can be resource-denying weapon if you're having a war and you turn off the electricity by the other guy. That's always a good thing. And sometimes it's to capture data or to manipulate data. It comes in all sizes and flavors. Now, this used to be someone else's problem. So if you didn't manufacture aircraft parts, then you couldn't care less. Some of these tools, source code also, were leaked in the last couple of years by insiders. Everyone has access, and some of these actually were weaponized. I helped some investigation where there was the first weaponized use of one of these NSA toolkits was used. So these toolkits have zero-day attacks where we have no protection. None of the standard tools can get to them, so it's a real problem. As I mentioned, the data layer is where a lot of the attack concentrates itself, and that's where some of my solution and research has concentrated on. And sometimes it's long-term residency. They just want to get in and steal data very slowly, or wait, they might need the data later. And sometimes it's proxy. They attack the university to go into the hospital, to go into where it is. And this is important because they're starting to have talk of, if I get hacked, why should I just sit around? I want to hit back, but who are you hitting? You have to be sure that you're hitting the right people, right? Otherwise, you're just doing the same thing everyone else is doing. So if you took a security course when I was in university, I guess they had ones also then. So they would teach you that there's the internal network and the external. You build a big wall, hide behind your wall, everything's great. Everyone should run updates. Now there's no problem, we're all good. And cyber warfare, like I said, was always someone else's problem. That's the old way of thinking. And you see this even in the enterprise where you have specialized departments for security or information, and they only do patching and updating. They have some tools to look at the stuff, but they're really mostly doing investigations and mostly on the insiders. And this is when you speak to them, and we've done surveys, so it's a recency bias. He has a lot of problems, but the problem that everyone's yelling at him is something that was done yesterday, and that's what he's doing, investigation. 1 in 100 will be a real attack. And if you look, there's a lot of statistics out there. Just throw some up now quickly. NIST, National Institute of Standards, they have sort of a classification of the kinds of attacks that we're seeing over the last 10 years. And you see there isn't a clear pattern. Things come in and out as different tool sets are developed and different things come into play. And even their classification, they have some level where they associate cost with severity of cleanup and things like that. The levels of the mediums and highs are just growing, and the lows are, it's a problem across the board, and it keeps getting worse. There was a big change around 2007 with infrastructure attacks like against DNS, a lot of sophisticated botnets and ransomware, and a lot of different zero-day and advanced threats. So today, for example, there is no internal and external. Everyone's in the cloud. There's this magic cloud. But then it's gotten very hard to decide what's inside and what's outside. Threats are developing very quickly. You don't have months and months, like with the code red. You actually had a month to patch the stuff. You don't have that anymore. I mentioned the double pulsar was a Windows zero-day attack that was weaponized very quickly after the source code was leaked. This was a very sophisticated hack. They broke into someone's modem. They knew that the person, for some odd reason, wasn't going to be working a certain day of the week. And they used that to jump into the VPN. I mean, they did a lot of interesting, sophisticated pieces. But altogether, it becomes a nation-state problem. And then, there's examples. Like I said, I'm not really going into crypto at the protocol or at the CPU level, but there's a lot of attacks now that are coming to light with weaknesses in SSL, open source for many years, but nobody bothered reading it. Even CPU architecture attacks where you can take advantage of Intel or AMD. And the Spectre attacks can actually be run over the web. So people are looking what else is out there they can do, right? Systems are being attacked. So that's where deception is starting to come into play. Deception is maturing. Like I mentioned, people are talking about hacking back. And then machine learning is coming into play. So let me talk a little bit about, very quickly, when people attack, this is sort of the chain that they follow. You know, they're looking around, they're figuring out how to attack, they get into the system, and then run the attacks. And these sort of correspond to the different kinds of tools that are out there. The earlier you can catch an attack, the cheaper it is to deal with. So the research that I've been involved in is on the right side is sort of the different research projects that speak to the different layers of the security model. So the deception components are more of a passive defense where you spread out these interesting documents, and when they get tripped, you get warning, and when they get stolen, you actually get attribution. Where are the attackers sitting? Looking at processes, and I'll run through these systems in a second, you know, looking at processes and figuring out how they're using the system. You can create a mathematical model, find out when this changes occurs, and then act on those. On the left side is the different startups that have been addressing the security in the real world, so taking some of the research that we've done and turning them into products. So at the network level, at the user level, and then across at the knowledge level. These are exciting sort of applications. So if we start at any host, laptop, server, refrigerator, usually we look at a CPU, it's running some kind of operating system. There's usually some third-party software, which means you don't have full control. And there's usually some kind of access control, which I can audit to look at things that are happening so I can actually see what's happening there and then learn from that. So usually when you think of a device, like I said, the standard way is put up a wall, put up a filter, figure out what's coming in, what's going out. Look possibly at the inside if you're allowed to, and then find things that you know are bad and pull them out. Next level is sort of having a knowledge base to know what to look for. Once you've been hit by code red, then you can recognize it and also update your filter going back up. And at the bottom is actually learning to classify, not just knowing this is bad, this is good. You know, when we talk about antiviruses, for example, traditionally they had a signature database. If something matches, you know it's bad because it's in the signature. But how do you get the signatures? So there's a couple of different ways I'll talk about. But you generally need people to be infected. So if you're the first 30 people to be infected, congrats, now everyone else is okay. But then the problem is that these viruses change very quickly. So using machine learning, you can create a model of what's normal and then look for deviations, measure them, and then possibly apply it. So like I said, traditionally, antiviruses used to be at the application level, looked at things that are running. If the user clicked on something, an executable shows up. I look at it. Do I know it? If yes, then maybe alert on it. If no, you know, can I test it? Can I put it into a sandbox environment and study it? Machine learning concentrates on finding something different about what I'm looking at. To get labeled data is the best. You don't always have access to that. So what you want to look at is unsupervised learning, which is you have a lot of data. You try to group the data and look for outliers. Using probabilistic modeling, you can actually find things that stand out and then go back and say, okay, from terabytes of stuff, I only have 1,000 events. What are they? And then encode the knowledge to do the filtering. And if you do it right, you can actually recognize zero-day and unknown attacks correctly. Emphasis on if you do it right. So the assumption, of course, assumes that something looks different. It's not true for every single attack, and you know, show off what we've done with certain kinds of attacks. And it's really tuned to the kind of model and the feature set. So some of the things that we've done in the research was to, instead of choosing the feature set, which is what a lot of people do in machine learning, we actually use some formulas to calculate this on the fly, which means I can change my model as I get more information and more devices. I can actually calculate and say, okay, I need to start using different features. So the models were not only self-tuning, but the feature set was also expanded over time. And the other assumption is that attacks are rare events. If it happens too often, then the data is too noisy, and then you have to use a different approach to it. But if attacks don't happen that often, and you can have a trace, then you can learn a model of what that looks like. So for example, the registry in the Windows is a central database. If I look how programs interact with the registry, I can build a normal and versus a deviant model, and then alert if something's not following that. And I can do the same when people are touching the files. People have patterns when they touch the files. Programs have patterns when they access memory. And your network activity, forget about what you're putting in the network, but how often. So think about when you use your machine, you'll switch between playing a game, doing homework, reading email, reading the news. You have some pattern, and people are pretty predictable. I'll show you some of the results of the user studies that we've done. So if you look at the volume and velocity of these audit trails that you're creating, and this is on the user level, you can do the same on the process and the same on device and network. You can actually learn what something normal looks like and then alert when it turns abnormal. Abnormal doesn't always mean something bad, but it means someone should look at it. So for example, this was one of the early works on the registry. What we found, there were patterns of how programs were using the registry. So certain programs were only hitting certain parts of the registry. What we modeled was the kinds of actions, read, write, change, edit, delete, into the registry. And what we did was try to figure out, can we calculate, if something doesn't happen that often, what would the probability be of it happening now that it doesn't happen that often? And what's the chance of not seeing it at all? And given the data, it gets smarter over time. But we were able to get excellent results where I collected a lot of viruses out there. We ran a controlled space where we ran a bunch of regular programs and viruses and looked at the data and then created a probabilistic model on the data and then ran new attacks that we hadn't seen and were able to detect them with very high accuracy. So then what we started to do is, once you're running programs, can you model the user's behavior? If I'm searching, can I figure out if the program is a searching program? Is it an editing program? Is it a Windows system program? What we did is create a bunch of categories on Linux and Windows and then later Mac. And what we did is we tried to model the features that we were seeing in the audit stream, trying to map it to what are you doing with this program and how you're using this program. And we also got very good results at profiling a program on the system. Then we looked a little lower at the data level. Since the data is really the goal, databases have great stuff. There are teams in some universities just protecting the database. But we decided to pick on the data level. So if I can monitor how people are reading documents, I can find normal flows and abnormal flows. I can model that this document is sensitive because it has a certain pattern to it. I can also use it to determine when a breach has occurred. If I have documents that no one's reading forever and somebody's starting to read a lot of them, I might want to look at why is their process being read. So this was an application of documents monitoring into the security space. We tied this into a deception system. Deception, it's been played out in different ways. Physically, in World War II a lot. Historically, it's been forever. On the computer science side and security, there's the idea of honey nets. In honey nets, what you have is you have fake systems that look real. The attacker comes in, you drive them to the honey nets magically. And the idea is that you can monitor what they're doing because they're dropping programs and doing stuff, so at least you get an idea of what they're up to. In addition, you're wasting their time. In theory, you're protecting your system because they're busy on this fake system and not on the real. Positive and negative, they're very high overhead to run. I know of somebody who goes in every day to a real hospital, and all he does is runs a fake hospital. He sits there with a bunch of servers, fake hospital, putting in fake appointments. It's a living, don't do it. Implementation is always the weak point. The enterprises that sell you honeypots, they sell these great stuff, but then there's, people find out it's not as easy to use and it just sits in the background. But for documents, we found out, we did studies, people are using a lot of cloud documents. You don't know who has access to it. Username and passwords get stolen all the time. In fact, you're sharing the documents. If I send a patent application to the lawyer, if it gets stolen from the lawyer offices, wouldn't I like to know? So what we did was we developed a technology to have the documents phone home. So we targeted Office documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and PDFs. And every time I tell my students that, we developed a PDF that has a virus and it phones home, no one ever opens up the homework examples after that. I don't know why. And the idea was we approached it in two different applications. For Decoy Documents, we created these really nice-looking documents. For example, fake tax forms. I put it all over my machine. I know what the real ones are. Someone coming in doesn't. When they get opened, what we did was concentrate on an agentless solution. So there are other, like Tripwire and solutions like this, but they require you to install something. The bad guy who's stealing your documents is not going to install that for you. So everything had to be self-contained. And what we did was we did some user studies and we came up with measurements of, how do you measure how believable something is, how enticing it is, and where to put it so that it's actually going to be found? And then the signals that are coming out, how do you measure that they're stealthy, they're not getting in anyone's way, and then how do you measure how often you have to update them? And we came out with a system we called the Decoy Documents, and we can actually spread it out and use it for early breach detection. With cyber attacks, a lot of the problems is figuring out who's actually attacking you. This is the biggest issue before you can hit back. If you compare it to physical weapons, there's a lot of warfare thing going back and forth. If there's a weapon, you can trace back where it came from, who built it, what the material is. There's a lot of different evidence in the weapons. With internet, anyone can fake any of the sources. It's hard to trace. With these documents, once they're stolen and they signal back, I get a signal from somewhere. The more signals I get, the more of a chance I know. We had a system where somebody had a company got breached. We sprinkled these documents, it got stolen. It showed up in different places. The guy who stole it was suspicious, of course. So he submitted to VirusTotal, and we see VirusTotal servers firing off as they check the documents. Then he opened it up on his Google phone. Thank you. Now we had his Google information. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do. There was another project that we did was something called active authentication. People, like I said, were building bigger walls. So the idea was if your username and password are stolen, can you actually figure out if it's not really you, even though you had the username and password? So the idea was to look at the user's actions, learn their search behavior, and then use that to measure, is it really the person who's on the system, even though they had a username and password. There was multiple players. This was a DARPA project. We did some user studies at West Point and some other corporations, and some corporations besides the military space. And what we did was we tried to find users who were all the same, figure out if we can differentiate them, and then figure out if we can learn their behavior and differentiate when it wasn't the user. So for example, at West Point, we had 60 students there. They're all taking the same courses. They had the same laptops. They had the same schedules, doing the same homeworks. But everyone uses their computer slightly differently. And then at some point, they were using it for 2 months. And then at some point, they were switching laptops with each other. So that data wasn't given to us till after we performed. So we had to detect, A, when the laptops were switched, and B, who was switched with. So if user A switches with B, and I have a model of A, I should be able to detect that now B is not only not the model, but A is really using the laptop. And we had really good success at the 98% recognition rate. So we're able to recognize pretty quickly. The challenge there was to do it within 15 minutes. You could not be more than have one false positive for every 40 hours of operation. So DARPA capped it to make it realistic. So you can't just send up alerts and hope that your answer is there. It had to be usable. So you could be wrong once a week and that's it. And the model actually got smarter over time because we asked for feedback and things like that. Internally, just in case you're curious, so there are different modeling techniques. One of them is called GMM, Gaussian mixture models. The idea is that if the features that you're modeling, say the registry areas that you're touching, has some kind of distribution, you can model the distribution, and then you can try to range an unknown point, where does it fall in the probability distribution. A lot of times there is no single distribution that can describe your data. So for example, I'm a lazy optimization on grading. I want to use your height to determine your grade. Not necessarily the tallest people have the same grade, so if you can have multiple heights that you can then model to a multiple Gaussian, you can then use it to get a more accurate picture of what the historical data has been, and then use it. The problem, of course, is that it becomes stale, so you have to continuously train the model. Those are operational issues. And then you have to measure how often to test and how big of a window. Some of the work that we did also is we used ideas from SVM, which is projection, to get a probability kernel. And the idea is to take the data you have, project into a higher dimensionality, and then use distance between probability distributions to get a measurement of how different something is. So for example, in the bottom, the idea is that you have two different users, and now you have some measurement on a model. You want to see, is it the same user or not? You have this probability density function that you could then use to get you a point in time. In addition, you have now multiple points where you're measuring. You have to also figure out a threshold. At what point do you think it's a bad behavior or not? So as I mentioned, we had a cap on 40 hours, 1 false positive. So if you have data you can train on, what you do is this threshold actually is learned over time and adjusted. So if it starts getting too chatty, you go back and ask the user, is it really you? And if you get a challenge and a response, you can go back and fine-tune the model. So I mentioned before there was a paper on using feature scores to then determine the set of features to monitor. So we had, I think, like 100 different features we could use. We didn't have time to run all the features. So you compute what's the minimum set of features that you want with some level of targeted accuracy, train it, learn a threshold, and then use it in operations. In practice, what we found was that measurements are not independent. You behave differently in this room versus the library versus home. So we did the same idea on mobile devices, try to figure out, is it really you? So I have a phone, I use it for a while. This makes it hard to program in phones. You drain the battery pretty quick. We built a model that was very lightweight. If it wasn't you, it would either challenge you or drop you into a deceptive environment. Again, deception as security. So if you take my phone and it's not you and it thinks it's not you, it'll give you a fake phone with all the fake contacts. That was really cool to build. And then what we did is we tried to model the user. We found out that just looking at a certain set of features without looking at their GPS or wireless location wasn't giving you good enough spread, because the context of where you are changes your behavior, which means your models are differently. So if you can figure out where you are, you have different models, and these models change over time. As I mentioned, now doing a larger project across different pieces, and the idea is to learn. So this is a Navy project using the principle that people have gut reaction where they can figure out things quickly, but it's not always accurate. So there's a balance between a gut reaction and then a slow process to figure out if that gut reaction is right. And this is across processes, hosts, networks, and applications. And the idea is to create knowledge pieces that then you can share. So if the network knows that the host is being attacked or the fridge is acting weird, it can taper its monitoring and modeling and use different kinds of processes to figure out something might be up. So this is to spread knowledge across different levels, not to be concentrated on one. So you'd imagine that at this point, things are hopeless. Don't use a computer, switch to paper and pencil. So solution is always to air gap, right? Just put a laptop on a stage, don't connect to anything, silver foil everywhere, and you're safe. A lot of organizations found that it's not true. First of all, with the cloud, you have no access to the cloud. You have no updates. Bring it in USB. Guess what? The controller on the USB is infected. Now your entire gap system is infected. It's not an easy way to clean up. I've heard a lot of stories from the industry in that space. And then in the end of the day, you still have sound waves, Bluetooth, radio waves, etc. There was a project that tried to take over, I mentioned VoIP phones. So we used the little metal in the button. So you have a button on the phone, there's a little piece of metal. We used that as an antenna to then broadcast data off the phone into the next room. So ear gap didn't really help you. There was another project that looked at vibrating the motor of a printer. So I mentioned using the printer to email documents, but if the printer is not on a network, you can use the motor, make some noises, send out Morse code, steal data that way. There's been a lot of different malware and APTs that actually used ideas like that to send out data very slowly. There was a project to use Google searches. So if I have a document I'm trying to steal, maybe a patent application, divide it into Google searches, search, and then pick up the search history or monitor it somewhere else and pick up the word. So there's a lot of different clever ideas of how to get stuff out. And being on a separate air gap network doesn't really help you. You really have to look at the fuller picture to solve the problem. And the biggest problem is that students like you're going out there and building systems, working on systems, not necessarily security your first view. And it's not just the students, it's anyone else. Across the board, security is generally a Band-Aid. It's like, oh, let's build something. It's due on Friday. Security, we'll add it later. Or we think we're secure because we're at the user level. The passwords are really hard to guess. You have to take in all the layers into consideration. There's a lot of different interactions that you don't realize. Case in point with the hardware bugs that I didn't talk about, where out of order execution ends up opening up all kinds of attacks. In SQL injection, these guys have been around forever. So here's a joke about somebody's kid's name erasing the school's computer tables. If you've taken a database course, I can see who's smiling. Otherwise, you'll get it when you take the database course. So that's sort of a nutshell, trying to fit everything in the time allotted. High-level point of security and where the behavior-based security has been used and applied. Any questions?
So I have a lot of interests, right? And I will focus on one of those interests for a while. And then I'll rapidly switch to a different interest. Wouldn't your system see that as someone else?
So that's a great question. So where we've deployed it, people have sort of roles, and that's what we're monitoring. We're really learning your role. So if your role changes, right, you could get a bump in pay, and now you're a manager. You're doing stuff differently. We would alert it. I said before, the alerts are not necessarily bad. It just means there's been a change in behavior. So if I can challenge you and you can prove you are, I go, hey, the model is wrong. I got to do something new. So what we've done in the past was then say, okay, I know nothing about this user. I'm going to start learning from fresh. There is a window, by the way, where you know nothing about the user and you can't say anything until you have a trained model. In that case, I'd say reset. It's a good question, though. It's not magic. Yes?
So you mentioned how for the previous models, you found a problem, send out a test for everybody, and then everyone fixes the problem, and save it. But with your behavior-based model, it sounds more for an individual user. You have a background process running through you said, oh, how is the user being interacted with? But then, if let's say they find there's a problem with you, this is one program that acts very weirdly, no one else knows.
So two answers. So the models that I showed were for the user can also be applied to processes. Both of them are reporting to some central pane of glass. Think of the security officer, instead of just monitoring for antivirus alerts, he's also getting behavioral alerts. So he's told that this computer is now behaving weirdly because of this information. So one of the big problems is when you get alerts in security, there's no information about the chain. But if you know that the process on this machine at this time is behaving weirdly, and if you tie it to the network, you can get a kill chain where you can actually recognize what happened. But there is noise in any data. So it's as good as that. Any other questions?
Hi. So I've been seeing a lot of new tactics that people have been using for isolation, like using in a lot of browsers now, they're using every single package called virtual machine, things like that. So I was wondering if you did any research on that.
So I haven't been concentrating on that part, whether the privacy or the isolation. It's very clear from past that isolation is hard to pull off. If you take a look at some of the reports on Spectre, which is the out-of-order execution, that actually the proof of concept runs in a browser, and it crosses that tab isolation, yeah, it's a problem. To an extent.